Well, good evening. Our special guest tonight is Dennis Brack. As you know, since you turned out for this program, he is a very distinguished White House photojournalist who's just come out with a unique book, Presidential Picture Stories Behind the Cameras at the White House, capturing an occupation that probably hasn't been documented in this kind of detail before. People like Dennis are usually the people who document the people in the White House, but this time he's documented the people behind the cameras. Dennis is a former president of the White House News Photographers Association, and he averaged a picture per week in Time magazine for 23 years, so not sure. He's taken pictures of every president from JFK to the current occupant, Mr. Obama, and basically has seen more history than most people have read. So let's hear more about it from Dennis himself, Dennis Brack.
Thank you. Well, thank you all for coming out this evening, and thanks, and I'm honored. Got Frank Johnson over here with the Washington Post and Ken Danforth here for former Time magazine. Tonight I'm going to tell you a little bit about presidents and photographers, probably a lot more than you really wanted to know. But I've been covering presidents for a long time, and actually for 53 years. And of course the reason I'm here is that I've written this book right here. And the reason I wrote it is that we have photographers coming into the White House today that are really good, men and women, talented photographers, but they have never seen a darkroom. They've never used a camera with film. So all the old stories that we've told through the years that have been passed down from photographers, presidents, and things about what film we used and things that we used have been lost. And it's a great deal of difference between the photographers today and the photographers that were back in this day. If you look, these people had probably 12 frames to take their pictures all day long, 12 clicks of the shutter. And these shutters were, and this was better than earlier, and these shutters, you would take the film and you'd put them in and you'd take the slide out and you'd click. And so it's very time consuming. You had to have split second timing. So this was a problem. So I've listened to these stories for many years. And as I said, I've covered presidents for since Kennedy. And so these stories had to be written down. And I wrote them down in this book. And so I have enjoyed doing this, and so I'm going to tell you a little about a history. Now, we've got 150 years of history to cover, so if we could have questions at the last, that'd be great, and there'll be time for that if I'm fast. So the other thing is about the pictures is that I took all the color pictures. The black and white were photographers who went before me. And things. Now, some subjects at the White House would love to pose for pictures, and this is Fala, FDR's dog, and he was very good. Others, not so much. This is General Blackjack Pershing, not giving a soundbite to L.C. Brown, and things. But let's start at the first. This is Matthew Brady. Now, wait a minute. Some of you young people probably think I was Matthew Brady's assistant, but that's not right. He was before my time. Anyway, President Lincoln said that Matthew Brady's picture and his Cooper Union speech made him President of the United States. They happened on the same day. Former Congressman Abe Lincoln was walking down Broadway. He took a right into Brady's studio, went and Brady came down and straightened up his collar, and he made this picture. And you got to remember that photography was brand new. They never had anything like this. But they didn't have any way to see it because none of the reproduction processes had been invented yet. So the best they could do was these little cards. Now, carte de vistas, and I'll pass these around. These were in show windows, and you could buy them. And so that's the way they learned about photography at the time was very complicated. It was the wet plate process, and I'm going to tell you about the tools that we used just to give you some idea about how photography has come along. First, you had to coat this plate, and then you had to rush. Of course, this was all done in the dark. Put it in a film holder, and then you'd rush and you'd take the picture. This is Senator Leahy getting his picture taken by Rob Gibson. And this Rob, after 100 years, has gotten this down here to about like that. But when they first did this, it took a whole big wagon of equipment and things. And so Matthew Brady, moves down to Washington, has a studio, still there today. You can see it if you know where you look around 6th Street and Pennsylvania Avenue. But he wants to cover the hostilities. Now, they called them the hostilities. They didn't know it was a civil war. But he knew there was going to be some stuff coming up. But he knew that big wagon couldn't get through Union lines. So he goes to his old friend, walks upstairs to his Lincoln's office, and he tells him. And Lincoln says, "Hey, no problem at all." Says, "Here." He takes out a 3x5 card, just a little smaller than that picture, and he writes, "Pass Brady, A. Lincoln." That's sort of the first all-access press pass. And so that's what he did. And there he is. And, of course, he did. And then, of course, he got Alexander Garner and a whole bunch of other photographers to document the Civil War. Now, I mentioned the technology. This is about the best. Woodcuts were about the best that the papers could do, which were not very interesting and they're very time-consuming. But along comes Fred. That's not Fred. That's just a picture. But you see those dots. Fred was a man from Syracuse, I believe, that invented this, the dots, and he broke the picture up into dots into the halftone process. So now, this is about 1887 that this process was going, but the newspapers didn't quite use them very much. It took until Teddy Roosevelt that they started using this because Teddy was a good subject, and the film got a little better than the static pictures that were taken. Quite frankly, the newspapers were very happy with what they had. They had drawings that were sensational. They sold newspapers. They didn't care about this. Teddy Roosevelt gets to the White House, and we, the photographers, missed the best pictures during that administration. Early in the morning, Teddy Roosevelt would come out to the banks of the Potomac, take off all his clothes, dive in, and swim over to probably what was Roosevelt Island. And then he would kind of rest up. Didn't have any clothes over there, but that didn't make any difference. Then he swam back, put on his clothes, and went to work. Now, the one thing he did do is he brought this fella, George Harris, to Washington. He was in San Francisco. He says, "George Harris, you come to Washington and set up. You've seen the pictures in textbooks, Harris and Ewing. This is the company that preserved the photographs for the first half of the last century." Teddy was a good subject, and George Harris was a pretty darn good photographer, and that's one of his pictures. Here's what was happening about after that. World War I is about to start, and we had, down at Fort Belvoir and Fort Meade, all these people coming to fight the war. And remember, the halftone made these things, so photographers were flocking to Washington. And the bureaus were being set up, and just about that time, Woodrow Wilson has his stroke, and everybody wanted pictures of Wilson. Nobody knew his condition, and except the First Lady and Dr. Grayson, his doctor. And the closest they could get was the sheep grazing on the White House lawn. And this was actually taken by George Harris, this picture. So they call in George Harris, and they say, okay, let's have a controlled situation. And it is. It's the first White House handout picture, basically. He's paralyzed in this arm. The First Lady is holding this because he couldn't possibly do it. And that didn't work. Everybody realized that that was a fake. So on Sunday afternoons and others, they had him going out in these car rides. And the photographers would get up at the southeast gate and photograph him. But all it showed was that President Wilson was a very sick man. And finally, this is the end of his administration. A little bit about tools. Here we've gotten a little bit more mobile. These things were, the pictures in this thing were 8 by 10, the size of a window frame in glass, but they were better than what we had. Harding's having a cabinet meeting. An aide comes, whispers into his ear. He says, cabinet meeting over, that's it. He goes out, and Laddie Boy, his Airedale, had just been given to him, and he had just arrived. Now, Harding was an old newspaper man. He knew the value of a good feature picture. And every time he had a big scandal, he would invite the photographers in and bring out Laddie Boy, and his problems were solved. Now, Calvin Coolidge was a friend of the photographers. And one time, one of the reporters asked him, what do you do for exercise? He pointed over the photographers. He says, I just do what they tell me to do, and that's plenty of exercise for me. But he was, what he really liked was the movies. He saw about a movie every night at the White House. One of the things he liked the best was the newsreels, because he realized this is the only way that the American people could really see. They couldn't hear yet because sound, and it was a voiceover, but it was coming along. So these fellows were kings about this time. This is 35 millimeter film because these things were shown in the movie houses. So there was no producer down here, there's nothing. It was just this guy doing the whole thing. And he had to really edit what he did. And so he was pretty good. Now we get to Hoover. Hoover and the photographers did not get along. He was one of the things I did was interview old photographers. When an old photographer saw me coming, it was sort of like the Grim Reaper showing up at your door. No more magazine subscriptions for you. And one of them was Johnny D. Josephs, who remembered Hoover. And he said that he was very nervous. He was always worried about doing something wrong and things. He kept the photographers waiting a great deal. And it was down and out war. And you can't really blame them because photography at that time was very painful, especially when they used flash powder. This was something new that we had. This is what the photographer would hold up. He would put his camera on a tripod, sometimes they could hold it, and put magnesium in this thing. And then he would trigger it by just, it's about like working a Zippo lighter and do that. And so that was what happened. One photographer in Denver was sent out to photograph a new hotel ballroom, and he liked to put a little zip in that. So put a little gunpowder in with the magnesium. he burnt the hotel to the ground. So anyway, one thing that they were really at odds on was fishing. And everybody was trying to get a picture of Hoover fishing, and he didn't like that at all. Johnny said that the real problem was Mrs. Hoover. She had the 15-foot rule. No photographer could get within 15 feet of her husband because he wore these horse collars, Johnny called them. He had a couple double chins, and so she thought by keeping them back, that would do it. That didn't work. Anyway, a little bit about tools. Now we're getting a new tool, the speed graphic, and that revolutionized our business, to speak. And we got a new president, FDR. Now you would think, with all the rules, that FDR and the photographers would not get along, but they did, because he always gave them something to make a picture by. Maybe it's just the jaunt of this or something, but he was really kind of a guy that would help the photographers, and so they followed his rules. Of course, one of them is photographing him in a wheelchair. I researched this. I never found anyone or any place except one John Gunther report, which was wrong, about any of the photographers, the professional photographers, photographing FDR as he was getting in or out of the car or anything. It just wasn't done. George Thames said that it just never came into their mind that they would not do that. These were terrifically different times than what we have today. But one thing about FDR is you wouldn't think he was a man of the people, but in a way he kind of was. He identified with people. He would be working at his desk. And remember, it took a long time to set up, so the photographers would come in and they'd set their tripods up, and he'd be looking at the newspaper. Remember that horse racing was big back then. We had Pimlico, which was a big track. And he'd look up and he'd say, "Who do you like in the fifth, boys?" And every one of them would say, "Oh, Sonny Boy's going to win," this thing. And he'd write them all down. Whether he actually put money on them, I don't know, but it certainly got him to the time. Now, of course, his dependent on his son and everything. These are the people that are the guys, and he always called us the boys, who were at Campobello. Now, and here's another reason that the things kind of went the way they wanted, is this man right here, Steve Early, and he was the press secretary, and he even had the control of telling them exactly the minute to take their pictures, which we don't even have that today, which is good. Now, you've noticed that I've said boys up until this point, because all photographers were men, all news photographers. And don't be fooled by the suits. These were rough guys. When a city editor was in the newsroom and he saw an aggressive copy boy, he'd send him over to the darkroom to be a squeegee boy, and he'd work his way up. And photographers were not somebody you'd take to dinner. But the war comes, just like Rosie the Riveter. Photographers all went either to cover the war or to fight as they were drafted or enlisted. And we have our first women photographers. And FDR liked them better than us. I don't know. This is actually the second picture of the swearing in. The photographers were out of position. They grumbled, and they said, well, let's do it again. And so they did. Harry Truman, when he was senator, was a good friend of the photographer. He judged our contest all the time. Max Desfor, who is 101 years old, lives out at Leisure World, picked Harry Truman up. He was our chairman of our picture contest committee. Picked him up at his office. They're walking down the hall. Harry stops and says, "Max, you stay right here." He runs back to his office, comes back with a brown paper bag. And then they go into the probably one of the hearing rooms where this was to judge it, and he takes it out, and there's a fifth of bourbon, and he says, "Now let's start the judging." So that's the way he was. You've always heard about his walks, his early morning walks, and they must have been a lot of fun. He'd walk out of the northeast gate, take a right, and he'd walk down F Street to about 10th Street. The shop owners would be waving, watching down, and yell, and it was great. Then take a right around 10th or 9th and go up around the Washington Monument. Harry Truman had a rule about the photographers. If you photographed, you just couldn't take one picture and go away. You had to walk the whole way because you had to get your exercise. These were his boys. And everybody liked it except one photographer. Johnny Roth, who was an AP, and he was a big guy. And Johnny would fall behind, and Harry would wait for him. And Harry didn't mince words. He let Johnny know that he needed to lose some weight. But anyway, Harry was a good friend to the photography. He had his own club, and he was always the president of the club. And the Just One More Club. Now this is a great picture. One reason is George Thames, who I'll talk about in a little while. The other is the scoops. See those there? There it is, right there. We still use those same scoops occasionally. Now our rules have changed a little bit, but they're still sitting there in the White House press room. One Sunday, President Truman called us all together, us being the White House news photographers, and I'm not in there. But a lot of the people I work with were, but he took our picture. We also had a contest. Only presidents could enter this category of our contest, and he won that every year. But I better go on to Ike. Now, Ike and the photographers were pretty good friends because a lot of these guys had photographed, were in the war, and he was Supreme Commander and then over at NATO, and they had worked with him for a long time. And so Ike knew the best thing about the way to deal with photographers is to give them what they want, and they'll be satisfied, and they'll go away. And that worked. Got an equipment update. That graphic was still being used, but we've got this Rolleiflex. Now, this is not the pretty little Rolleiflex that everybody has. This thing, the first thing they did was take the ground glass and cement that and put this sports finder, and then they had this little knob there, which would put 6 foot, 8 foot, and it was a great news-making machine. Another reason that everybody liked Ike and worked well was his press secretary, James Haggerty. That's him right there. Arnie Sachs said that James Haggerty was a man of his word. When he said something, that was the way it was. That's something for press secretaries to learn, that's for sure. Again, our equipment is changing. We've got faster film now and smaller cameras. That meant we could take candid pictures, and it couldn't have happened at a better time for a better subject. John F. Kennedy hated corny pictures. A hat would stay on his head about a second, but there'd never be a headdress, never. But so he started using these. First, he knew he was a great subject, but second, he picked about 3 or 4 photographers who we could trust and who had good photographic sense. This one right here is Jacques Blow. Now, Jacques Blow, you saw his pictures, Nantucket, everything, to about the first 2 months of the president in office. Jacques was, the president called George Thames in. George Thames worked for the New York Times. And he says, "George, why did you take this picture of me with glasses on, and why did you let it get into the New York Times?" Well, George looks at it, and he says, "I didn't take that picture. Look at the credit." It was Jacques Blow. he immediately called Pierre Salinger in and said, that's it, cut off Jacques Blow, never again. He's out of here. And so no more exclusives for Jacques. George was the big benefactor. George was a great photographer, probably the best of the news photographers. So what they did is they created a day in the closet, and where you would sit quietly and then make just a few pictures at various parts of the day. Now this was very hard for George, the sitting quietly, because he talked all the time and had the greatest jokes and everything. But George, and this is something all photographers know, if somebody does something once, there's a good chance that they're going to do it again. Now George covered Kennedy up on the Hill when he was senator, knew about his back, and the Russell office building, he had a window, same thing. Kennedy would go to the window and he'd lean over and read. Sure enough, George sitting there, he goes and he does exactly the same thing. And so Kennedy hears the click of the camera, and Kennedy is reading the New York Times, and there was an editorial writer that wrote probably one editorial that he didn't like. And he looks over at George and he says, George, can you believe that he's written this stuff? He didn't say stuff. Anyway, and George says, well, that's the way it is. There's one great story about this picture that George was a very good printer. He made 3 prints, and then the negative was lost. And all those pictures for 25 years were done from a copy negative from one of his prints. He retired, and he thought he was giving his pictures to the Museum of American History until the New York Times found out about it, and he wasn't. But they had a little researcher there, and George had gone on vacation. He had a pile of papers and on the desk in the kitchen. And he says, I want to throw these out, but I want you to look at them. Picks up this little piece of scrap paper, and it said, LJSD. And George goes, my God. Runs upstairs to his sock drawer, goes in the back of the drawer, and there is an envelope with the name. It was loneliest job in sock drawer. And that's where that negative was all the time. Anyway, this is the first picture of the LBJ administration. Cecil Stoughton, he's sweating. Sweating because there are 26 people in this thing, and he's using a lens that he never used. He just got it the day before. But he made some good pictures, and there's also lots of stories in the book about what happened after he made these pictures. Now, LBJ would treat everyone on a one-on-one basis. If he liked the picture, he'd tell you. If he didn't like it, he'd tell you. And he didn't like this picture. Called Charlie Gorey in next day. He was the AP picture photographer who made that. Charlie, why'd you take a picture like that? You got me in a heap of trouble. Probably didn't say heap either. Anyway, Charlie just said, oh, I'd never do that again. But you knew he would. Charlie Tasnady and I, that's my picture. I took that. We're at Bethesda Naval Hospital, and he's sitting around this. You'd think it's a pool, but it was the helipad. And Frank Cancelleri is way over here. Frank is an excellent photographer. He took the picture of Dewey Winds. But he saw what was going to happen. But he didn't make it. LBJ just pulls back, and he just for that long. And we were sure. Charlie made the first frame, and I followed. But we were sure that he was going to get up and just be in our face. But he didn't. I asked Jack Valenti, who was his chief of staff, many years later, what happened? And it says he wanted people to know he didn't have cancer. But my explanation is that was just LBJ. It's just the way he was. Got to say one word. Okamoto was the first White House official photographer, perhaps the best. Now, Nixon's in. He's looking at the papers the next day. Everything is terrific, except this man in a hunting jacket. And his aide, he calls his aide, who does that man work for? And he says, well, Mr. President, he works for you. He's your official photographer. And he says, not anymore. So Cecil Stoughton, he was an Air Force photographer. He was immediately transferred to Germany. But Nixon and the photographers got along very well. He came to 5 of our dinners, which is amazing. And he was fine. One thing he did is he changed our press room around. This is where we used to be. And it was in the diplomatic lobby. And and this is the reason for it. This nice place. Henry Kissinger wanted a new office. So we went to California, and we came back to the covered up White House swimming pool, which is underneath here. And you can still go down to it. If you know a technician, there's a trap door right there that you can go down and see FDR's pool. It's still preserved. Now, this is what it looks like today. This is where we work today. This is photo country. And Larry Downing and the AFP photographer. And this is where we process our pictures. 2 stories, Nixon. One is the China trip. The other, and they had the best photographers, Horst Voss, John Dominus, Dirk Halstead, Wally McNamee. And Time didn't, I was supposed to go, but Time didn't get a space because life kind of Bigfooted us here, and that was it. But we all got a piece of Watergate. And you'll remember, this is John Dean, of course, Leslie Stahl, not Frank Johnson, he's over here, Sam Donaldson. But it all came down to that one last day. You could either be inside or outside. The Nixon advance team was about the best you could get. And they told Bob Doherty and David Kennerly and myself, and I think Ron Bennett, says, you're going to need a ladder, because at the last minute, they brought these troops up. And sure enough, they did. They came down, and we were at the end of a roll of film. And he did this, and you never know what's coming next. We didn't know if he was going to do it, but finally he did the double whammy. And we were just saying, just get on the helicopter. Ford was a friend on the Hill, and if you wanted something, he was not going to change. He was a terrific thing. One of the reasons he was a good friend was David Hume Kennerly, who was his official photographer. One time, we were, and this is the best day that I ever had at the White House, which is the bicentennial. And so we went up to Valley Forge, the tall ships, and the biggest thing was going to happen as the fireworks. And so they were going to be on the Truman balcony. And so we went up there, the 4 of us in the pool, to do this. And the forts were having a drink. And the first fireworks came. And they were way over to the side. And so the little aide says, well, just didn't work out. And says, no, they're going to work out, Ford said. And says, get these guys a gin and tonic, and we'll be over here, and just call us when we're ready. Well, 2 gin and tonics later, we made our picture, but that was just Jerry Ford. Another thing, remember this mansion didn't have a pool. You can't have a mansion without a swimming pool, so they dug one out in the backyard. And everybody wanted a picture of the photographers wanted. David asked and says, bring them on by one morning. So we did. There's George Thames. That's a younger Dennis Brack there. But anyway, and so he did a perfect drive, swam a couple laps, and he got out. Now I want to show you the robe. This is his terry cloth robe, probably from Jenny's Lane, right here. You don't see any seals. This man didn't need anything to say he was president. It was just Jerry Ford, and that's just the way he was. Those are nice pants, too. You don't get those pants. there's a lot of talk about the photographers and their pictures costing the presidency. One thing that Jerry Ford did not hold this against us. He knew we were just doing our job. One group that really wanted him to be elected was the Secret Service. First of all, they were his kind of guy. But they'd also heard about Jimmy Carter and the agents assigned to that detail. And it was a hard thing. But that didn't happen. Jimmy Carter gets elected. The first day, he is going to come out and redo government. He's going to the Department of Interior and everything. Worked fine until there was this tiny little bit of ice, and he slipped. Well, that was the picture in the front pages of all the papers. So, anyway, it went downhill from there. Now, this is the same Truman balcony where we were standing, and I think this is the only picture that a news photographer ever got up on the second floor. And Jimmy Carter comes in, and he looks at me. He knew who I was. I was at the time photographer. And he says, "What are you doing here?" And I says, "Well, we're doing a story on Rosalind." And Rosalind came in immediately and says, "Jimmy, they're just doing a story on me. And you just sit down in that chair and let this man take your picture." And so he did, and he put up his thing. But he was not happy. Anyway, ran a couple of pages, big in time. Ham Jordan and Jody Powell were great guys, but they could care less about photography. So we didn't get any breaks there. Jimmy Carter had two modes. One was the big smile wave mode, and the other was the pensive mode. So if you get, that was what you got with him. These were hard times, remember. We had the gas crisis, the ironic crisis, so you really couldn't blame it. But along comes a happy plane. Ronald Reagan had a way, and I've talked to a lot of people, I just talked to Chris Wallace about this the other day, that the candidate sets the mood of the plane and the whole thing. This was easy going. The Reagan campaign plane was terrific, happy, and the press corps was happy. Even the Secret Service, a lot of the agents still remembered that as a very good time. One thing he had was a great advance man. Mike Deaver knew pictures, he knew how to get them, and he wanted them. He wanted a great picture at Normandy. Every president goes to Normandy. He actually took a photographer on the pre-advance, Larry Rubenstein of UPI, and everybody lays a wreath at the grave of General Roosevelt, which is a great story, of course, you all know. But the last time Jimmy Carter did it, we had a fight with the French. We got in early, and the French tried to roll us, and that we were having a fight over the grave. Americans won. I think the general would have been pleased. I'm not sure. But anyway, so Larry says, wreath layings are just nothing. Well, could you have them walking out in the grave? And they said, "Oh, we can't do that." But some clever advance man said, "Why don't we have them lay two wreaths?" So they gave Nancy two wreaths. One they laid here, and then they came right on over here. The only problem is there's usually a Secret Service agent here and one here. Well, they cut a deal to come back, and so we get this picture, which was pretty darn good. I'll go a little faster here, but Nancy helped me out on a picture that with a remote camera, and she didn't have to. She came down, and there's supposed to be flowers in this, and she says, "Do we have to do this?" And Rex Stoughton, the usher, said, "No, that's it." And I just said, "These are wooden flower parts." I cut one hole, and it looked a little phony, so I cut 6 holes. And she says, "Okay, since you sanded 6 hours on each of these, Dennis," and she'd known me for a long time, and she says, "I want them there, but I don't want any flowers in them." And so that's the way. There's one here, one over here, and sure enough, it worked, and this ran fairly large. Ask any photographer, Frank will probably tell you too, Frank Johnson, who is the president they like the best. And that's Bush 41. Terrific man, kind of goofy at times. He called us the photo dogs, and which was fun. He knew everybody. He knew everybody and something about anybody because he liked people one-on-one. You know, this is just the way he was. And of course, there was the big story of the first Gulf War. Our technology. Now, we are developing the negative film and scanning it. This is on a campaign train, actually, that we were doing this. But every August, he would have a party for about 20 photographers and their wives. That's my wife right there. And this is, I just come off the the Clinton campaign, and he was there and he promised we'll be right here next year, and of course we weren't because this man got elected. That campaign, you could do anything. Follow him to the bathroom, do anything until he got elected. That was it. The Clintons were big on the official things, but there were not any behind the scene except Diana Walker, and she did a good job. But we got to tell you, again, we're changing. The first of the digital cameras came in. These were not very good. They had, the pictures were sort of salmon colored, but now we can correct those images. We had lots of motorcades, but we didn't need any access for this story because it was right on their faces. Every time you saw them, you knew this drama was unfolding in back. So it was good years for photographers at that time. There's our good friend Putin sizing up Bush 43. I don't think he ever figured out what he was about. But anyway, Bush 43 was a friend, and I think David Kennerly had it the best. He liked photographers, he just didn't want to have them around. Anyway, he had names for his favorite photographers. This one right here, Charles Omni from Newsweek, he called Chuckles, and always razzed Charlie about his hair, but I must say that Chuckles gave as well as he got. This one, incidentally, is Kevin Lamarck of Reuters. There were three photographers that went on the trip to China. Kevin still works for Reuters and was one of those three photographers. This is Larry Downing, also a Reuters photographer, who was one of Bush's friends and favorites, but Larry's been a favorite for everybody. We all agree that Bush 43 was his friend, but not the friend that his father was, which we all loved. Now, remember, we have not had a small child in the White House since Amy Carter. And we all remember how that didn't work out very well as far as Amy. Remember that picture of her going to school, and it was not. So, we knew this was coming up. The Obamas were ready for a fight. The fight didn't happen because the bureau chiefs all got together and we made a rule. And it was basically the Associated Press and David Ake who did it, saying, we will not photograph the children unless their mother or father are in the frame. And this rule was so simple that it's held to this day. There's been some arguments by people that didn't know, but basically that's what it is. We've had a little trouble, and it's a long thing about and you've read about it in the releases of the pictures, which the news photographers don't care about that. If they want to put them on Flickr, they can do whatever. Pete Souza's a terrific photographer. He was one of our members and things. That's not our thing. It's the access that we want. And actually, we're getting a little bit more cooperation now. But it's that denial of the access that we care about and things. We've changed a little bit. These guys are not taking a nap in the Rose Garden. They're And you will see the pictures in the paper, these low dramatic angles. These were taken by remote cameras that will be around behind the president that we can trigger now with a radio. This is Scotty Applewhite. Scotty Applewhite is the best in Washington. You'll see in the Washington Post every day, J. Scott Applewhite, Associated Press. He has been for years, and he's on the Hill now, but he's everywhere. He is one good photographer. I'm just about through, but I got to tell you about vice presidents, just a little bit. This is Cactus Jack Garner. He was FDR's first vice president, and I'm told that you would go into his office and you take a picture, and then he'd open his drawer and a fifth of bourbon would come out, and everybody would have a drink. And that's the way he was, a little difference. This is Joe Biden. He was head of the Judiciary Committee when the Clarence Thomas hearings. There would be a lot of breaks and things, and Joe loved to talk, and still does. And so he would come over and talk, and we all got to know him pretty well, and still do. He has this one story about me. I had a list of 10 would-be senators before he was senator for time. And Ken, you might have participated in one of these, but I just had to get these guys. And I called up. I got a voice on the phone, and I thought it was his press secretary. I says, I just need about a half hour with the candidate at a rally. She puts her hand, this is him, now I found out from him, because he's told this story many times. He puts her hand over the phone and says, Time Magazine wants to photograph us at a rally. This was his wife, and so this is the first wife that he had, who died in the car wreck. And he said, Jones Beach at 11 o'clock. Now there's a Jones Beach just above Dewey, Delaware, and on Saturday. So I show up. They got all their friends, and they made these signs, and they said, you love us, but you don't know us. You're just fans. And so we're walking down the beach, and sure enough, some seagulls come along, splat right on Biden's head. And so anyway, he's telling this is right in an announcement at the War College where Obama is going to just make some fierce statement, and he's walking on the thing, and here's the Secretary of Defense laughing like. Anyway, this is what happens with Joe. Joe, the one thing when Joe starts a story, he's going to finish the story, and so anyway, that's the way. I'm through. And I just have to say that the whole thing about covering the whole White House and presidencies, you just don't know what's coming next. And it's sort of like turning the page. And here we are. We're going to start another whole session there. So there's the book. And I hope you enjoyed the talk. And thank you. And I'm here for questions. Oh, yeah. Peter's got a microphone, so if you'll wait over.
Thank you very much. It was very, very interesting and informative and insightful. I wondered about how I don't know, are you a still photographer? You're a camera photographer, interfaced with the moving picture photographers who would start taking pictures for the newsreels in movie theaters.
Yes.
And then that morphed into the television photographers taking pictures for the evening news or whatever. So it started with just a camera photographer such as yourself and evolved into camera plus movie. And then it evolved into camera plus
Actually,
television. So I just wondered, how did that work from if you wanted to comment from your perspective as a photographer.
Well, the little history is back in the 20s, the stills and the movie were all the same company. National Picture Association was, and they sold. They have two different photographers, but they were all one company. Then the newsreels, which was MGM and the big movie houses, came in with the 35 millimeter that we showed, and then and that was completely unionized, and that union controlled everything. And then the networks came up, same union, and then the union that represented it, and it was a very tight union. You would probably have to be a son to get a slot in this, and so. But then television came along, and they were doing things. The studio photographers were out with non-film cameras, and they went to the union and said, "Would you want to retrain these and things?" And they said, "We want no part of this." So they started a new union, and they took over, and the old union just went by the way. That was a very bad decision on their part. There's always been a battle between stills and video, but one of the things that our White House News Photographers Association has done is smooth things over, and that we're all fighting for the same space. But I mean, one of the biggest NBC cameraman, Rodney Batten, my son and his son has been playing for years when they were small, because he was on our contest committee and things. So you see this big, horrible thing of massive photographers, and you think, God, that's just awful, and things, and people going. But it really isn't, because on a thing that we control, if somebody doesn't have a shot, you can hear, "Are you all right?" "No, I need a couple of seconds," and they'll pull back. And so everybody, at the end of the day, it's like working at a factory. Everybody knows that maybe today they're in position, but the next day they might not be. And so that's the way it works.
Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you. Dennis, thanks. We're former colleagues with Time Magazine, I wanted to say. And this is fascinating about your coverage of the presidents, but I wondered if you had any anecdotes you wanted to tell about other types of coverage. And I would like to tell a little one about that it reflects very well upon you. In November or December of 1965, I had my first traveling assignment, and it was to go down to Fort Jackson in Columbia, South Carolina, and we were doing a cover story. The man of the year, General Johnson, who was building up our forces for the mess in Vietnam. And I was trying to interview the draftees around there, and every time I would pull a young man aside, I was young then myself, and try to interview him, there would be a lieutenant and a captain and a couple of sergeants would gather around him, and so he was intimidated and couldn't talk frankly with me. So you and I conferred, and you would pull these officers aside and ask them to pose for pictures, and their egos got the best of them. And they would get over there, and so I would get some candid comments from these draftees. Yeah. I wonder if you remember.
Well, you just reminded me of exactly what happened with another the same situation. Scotty Applewhite that you saw there, and I were the first photographers in this DOD pool to go over when Bush said, "Okay, we're going to send the 82nd over." There's a DOD beeper and I was the magazine photographer, and Scotty was the wire service photographer. And sure enough, completely controlled by just guys like that. And unwittingly, Scotty would pick a fight with them because he wanted to cover something over here. And so that would let them, and of course, they had a TV crew, a CNN crew, part of the thing. So they just didn't have enough handlers to go around. And so I was free to just walk around and take all the pictures I wanted because I had these two diversions. But sometimes you have to do that. That was it. Anyway.
You had mentioned video and stills, and now that the same camera can take both video and still, is there an expectation, a greater expectation for the photographer to be able to do both?
It's coming, yeah. Frank is using a camera right now that you can pull a frame, but you can also, while it's taking the video, you can be a still photographer. And one of the great things, I wish you could see it, is these little GoPro cameras. Jason Reed is a photographer for Reuters. He now works in Australia, but he was at White House, and he was covering that trip to Burma, where Obama, that first one. And he just put that GoPro on the top of his camera. And it's terrific because you could just see everything that was going on as they were backpedaling and things. And then you would see the stills that he did. But yeah, it's coming. There's no doubt about that. But then again, exactly why Peter and I were talking about this book. When I came into the White House 53 years ago, if somebody had told me that I would be walking in there, which I'll do tomorrow, and not have a film camera, have a camera with no film, I would have said, you're crazy. Well, I hope that someday, whatever use, and we'll probably be some sort of an editor that's not even a photographer, 50 years from now, we'll maybe pick up this book. It's in all the right places to be preserved. And so who knows what they'll be using.
As a photographer, then, wouldn't it be difficult to try to think video and stills?
It hasn't been done very well, no. They're two different animals because the video needs sound, and this is the downfall of that whole thing. It's something that you really have to pay a great deal of attention to get sound, that's why the networks have two-man crew. That's it. So anyway.
What about copyrights?
The copyrights to.
In your lifetime?
Well, it has. It's been since the internet. We used to make a lot of money off of sales of pictures. Now we make nothing, because there was no way to do it. You had to get the actual pictures. Now you don't have to do that, and they've driven the price of pictures down to nothing, which it's just technology, and it's evolving. We all try to kind of police that, and we've got programs that Pick Scout that will go and find your and that you try to collect. The only people that are going to collect, and they do, is Getty, because they're so big that, and they're only going to collect it from magazines and newspapers. They're going to need them in the future, because otherwise everybody's going to say, the heck with you, I'm not going to do it. And so, yeah, it is a problem. And there are people that take their whole life to think about copyrights and things like that. I've always just trying to take pictures.
So with a book, how does that?
Well, yeah, it's a problem, and that fortunately for me, I only had to buy one picture for this book because all of them were mine, except in the black and white. That one, and I really could have gotten away with it, saying because the profits are going to go to the White House news photographers. But I bought that George Payne's picture, The Loneliest Job. All the rest were by photo agencies like Harrison Ewing. They gave, when they went out of business, they gave everything to the Library of Congress. And so that's public domain. National Photo Company, all those earlier pictures were given to the Library of Congress. And so anybody can get them, and they're public domain now. Thanks. Yeah. Library of Congress is a terrific place to shop.
Can you tell the story of when you photographed the Beatles?
Oh, yeah. That was fun. I was very young. That was my first assignment for Black Star, and I really didn't even know who they were, but I was told to go to Union Station, and did, and went. They came off the train. The Beatles had just done the Ed Sullivan show the night before, and they came down for a concert at what we had is an ice rink, basically, and that was all there was. And so they came, and this big old, well, it was new then, but it was a big Cadillac, and so I followed them up to, and then they had a press conference at this ice rink, and a British photographer says, "Do you have a car?" And I said, "Yeah." I says, "Pull it right up next to the Cadillac, so your bumper is touching." So I did, and he got in. He needed a ride because there's not enough room in the thing. And what nobody knew is they wanted to take a picture in front of the Capitol. So we went quickly and did that, and then the rest of the press followed, but they didn't know, so they weren't quite as quick. And so I got a picture of them in front of the Capitol, and then we went on the hotel. Then that evening, they did appear and at that ice rink, and it was only a 23-minute show, I think, but it seemed like it lasted forever. And one of the things that it was a 360 degree, and they were out in the middle. And at one point, Ringo realized that this half of the audience wasn't seeing them. So he got off, and he turned his drums around, and they turned everything around, and they played to the other side. And the little kids were, it was a terrific thing. And you couldn't do that today, photographing any personality, I don't think.
What advice do you have for somebody who's in high school who's interested in getting into photography?
I would say, I, of course, finish high school and finish college, and then pay attention to your writing and go into the video portion of it, because every still photographer is a video photographer these days. We call them now, we're no longer photographers, we're storytellers, and so that's what you have to do. And who knows what you'll have to be doing in the future, but you're really turning in, and we've always done this. I mean, look at these guys that only had, we are editors with our eyes. So we have to boil down everything into that one instant that is the best that tells the story. Whether you're doing it with a big speed graphic and or not, I got to tell you one story. I hope I'm not taking it about a photographer who missed a picture. We all have ones that were missed, and this is the one. Maurice Johnson coming out of the White House. They hear shots over at Blair House. This is when the Puerto Ricans were doing the thing, and so they run West Executive Avenue, which is closed. Pennsylvania Avenue was open in a regular street. West Executive was too. And he runs, and he first photographs the guard who had been shot. And then, as remember those big cameras, taken, and it takes time to do that, he hears Harry Truman, and he looks up, and here's Harry Truman in his undershirt, leaning out the window like this. What's going on out there? And he is going like this, trying to get his camera up, and the Secret Service agent grabs Harry out of the. It bothered him all his life that he missed that shot. He was thinking, if I had just looked up there instead of looking down there, but he didn't. So it's capturing the action. Ken, you?
I wonder, we both covered the March on the Pentagon, October the 21st, 1967, and you must have taken hundreds of pictures. And I know there was one out there with the protesters facing off against the U.S. Marshals.
Yeah.
And then you had a photo the night before of Norman Mailer drunk as a snail darter up at the Ambassador Theater. And I was wondering if you must have taken, excuse me, hundreds of pictures, and I'd like to know if you have any recollections you'd like to share of that epic day.
Actually, I am in one of the most famous picture out of that was taken by Bernie Boston of the Washington Star, and it's of the protester putting the flour in. Well, if you look into, I've got it, because I'm writing back, I'm in the middle of the troops, and it's kind of a funny picture of me, and Bernie, he's cropped it so, but I've got the full frame of me taking a picture like that, and he says, I was so worried that you're going to mess up this picture. but it was a very famous picture, but I've got it with this guy. But yeah, I've looked through those, and then we all got up to the Pentagon, and then there was an order, and all this stuff was like, they just moved forward and just crushed everybody, which...
Some protesters got inside the building.
Yeah, you didn't know, we didn't have any communications at that time, knew what was happening, but all of a sudden, everything was peaceful, and then boom, that was it. So anyway, yeah. Well, thank you all very much for coming.
Thank you all for coming out, and Dennis has some copies of his book, and they make a great
Make some good.
holiday gift, so beat the crowds, and happy
How are
Thanksgiving.
you? Good to see you.